Martin guessed, the talk is based on a chapter of the book that he mentioned, Multiculturalism, and I brought some book flyers around it so you can have more details about the book if you're interested, though I'm so gratified to see that some people already have got it and possibly have read it, so that's good, except that it'll be a bit disappointing for them because they're going to hear something that's already something that they've read. In fact, I've become increasingly interested in secularism, and it's, if you like, my next project, theme that I intend to work on. But what I'm giving at the moment is something based on stuff that I've already published in that book and elsewhere. And the talk is about multiculturalism and secularism. You know, it's about Muslims, very largely. Thoughts that I have been stimulated by issues around Muslims in especially Western Europe, issues that Muslims have raised or other people have raised about Muslims, or that, you know, there's some kind of a political contestation between them. That's very much the context of what I want to talk about. As Martin indicated, I've come to these issues not from Islamic studies or some other possible routes. I've come to these issues very much from thinking about ethnicity, post-immigration ethnicity in contemporary Britain. And I say thinking about, but not thinking about in a very ivory tower way, because most of my work deliberately seeks to be relevant and, I'd like to think, engaged with real world issues and with the public that I'm part of. I begin then by talking very briefly about what I understand by multiculturalism, by political multiculturalism. I'm not interested, for instance, not here anyway, in what we might call epistemological multiculturalism, or what some people talk about as relativism and so on. I'm only interested in a political concept. And issues, as you'll see, about secularism have emerged for me very much because of this political idea, the implications of this political idea. And I'll therefore begin by offering you a very, very brief, few-minute sketch of what I mean by multiculturalism, because the concept obviously has different meaning for different people. Though I think the biggest divide, actually, is not amongst what we might call students or theorists of multiculturalism amongst themselves, but between them and the political discourse of multiculturalism. Because we know in the last few years, multiculturalism has come to be blamed for just about everything, from segregation to young people rioting and fighting with the police, to suicide bombers and terrorism and what have you. But most of the people who use that discourse either haven't actually read any literature about multiculturalism, or they're quite willing to distort what the literature says. So many of the things that they say, well, multiculturalism is X, Y, and Z, and I've actually been at meetings in Britain and elsewhere where I've said to people, to, you know, quite hostile public critics of multiculturalism, I said, that's an interesting thing that you say about multiculturalism. Could you just tell me what your reference is? What is your source? Where did you get this version of multiculturalism from? Is it B. Parek, Charles Taylor, Will Kimlicka? Who are you referring to? And they say, everybody knows what we mean by multiculturalism. So there is a commonsensical understanding of multiculturalism, which is widespread, you know, across our continent for a start, but which is actually based on a caricature, I would argue, on a caricature of the understanding of multiculturalism in the literature. And I think central to the genuine understanding of multiculturalism is a concept of equality, or possibly two concepts of equality, because if it is a concept of equality, it's an extended or double aspected concept. And different theorists, of course, do express this idea in different ways. I wouldn't like to say everyone does it just as I'm about to present it to you, and perhaps the way I present it to you is my own take on it. Though I think the way I'm going to present it to you owes most to Iris Marion Young, the American political philosopher and feminist who passed away a little while ago. And she says, well look, there is a concept of equality that we all understand because it informs ideas like the civil rights movement of the United States, the African-American struggle for civil rights in the 50s and 60s. It informs anti-apartheid in South Africa. It informs anti-discrimination ideas. And that is basically the right to assimilate, because this is a concept that applies to minorities or outsiders, the right to assimilate to the majority or dominant culture in the public sphere with toleration of difference, some socially, politically identified difference in relation to a group. Toleration of that difference in the private sphere. So basically, assimilate in the public sphere, but do whatever you like in the private sphere. And she argues, rightly I think, that this was the idea that inspired, that was behind people like Martin Luther King. But her argument is that there's something deeply flawed about this idea as a concept of equality, because actually it's not egalitarian, because what it immediately does is divide the relevant body of people, citizens possibly, into two. Those who are somehow the majority, the norm, just taken for granted, that's how things are done. And other people who clearly have a lesser status, a second-class status, because their duty is to become like the other group, because that's what assimilate to the majority means. So, but of course they can do whatever they like in private, but in the public culture, the assumption is that they need to be more like the first group, that their equality is dependent upon their approximating to the first group. And therefore we have two classes of citizens, those who don't need to assimilate and those who do. And genuine equality, Young argues, should include, not exclude and privatize to a, if you like, to a kind of ghetto or to an insignificant or relatively insignificant sphere of life, but should include those dimensions of difference that marks certain groups in the population. Marks them in such a way that issues about equality arise, like racially marks them, or marks them in terms of sexual orientation or gender or whatever the difference might be. But that difference marks that population, and that's why the issues about equality arise, because those people are treated differently and in an unequal way. So treating them equally requires recognizing that difference, including it in the public sphere, not banishing it to the private sphere. So the second concept of equality, or the second aspect of equality, is the right to have one's difference recognized and supported in both the public and the private spheres. And I think that that second idea of recognition and support in both the public and the private spheres are critical to multiculturalism. The two together are really at the heart of multicultural equality. Neither by themselves, because I don't want to say that the second concept supersedes the first. That would be mistaken. Because I do think we need a concept that recognizes, as it were, sameness in the public sphere. We do need some concept like that for non-discrimination. But the argument is that that concept by itself is not enough. We need a second concept which is more positive about difference, rather than, as it were, is blind to difference in the way that we talk about colorblind in terms of race and so on. Well, if that is our idea of multicultural equality, what does it look like when we apply that idea to religious groups? Now, most multicultural theorists who developed their arguments, like Young herself, like Will Kinderker and Charles Taylor, actually, when they were thinking their theories, they weren't thinking about religious groups. They were thinking about language-based groups, or race and gender-based groups, etc., etc. It's quite ironic that Iris Young's book, her best-known book, Justice and the Politics of Difference, published, I believe, in 1991. If you look up the index, there is no term for religion, or Muslim, or Christian, or Jew, or Sikh, or anything like that. She just wasn't thinking about religious groups. But what if we now think about religious groups, as indeed we have had to? Because the issues that confront us, especially in Western Europe, but increasingly in places like Canada and the United States as well, are around, as it were, the difference of being a Muslim, not just the difference of not being white, or the difference of language and historical heritage, as in relation to, say, the people in Quebec or indigenous people in Canada and so on. Well, I think that we get a concept of religious equality which has three dimensions to it, and each dimension takes the concept and makes it fuller or thicker. And you will see, as the talk continues, you'll see that by making the concept thicker, it actually creates issues for certain forms of secularism. The first aspect or dimension, I think, is relatively uncontroversial, and that is no religious discrimination. That no one should be discriminated, for instance, in job recruitment because they're of one religion or another, or they are not of any religion, and so on. That's pretty obvious. I won't talk about that. The second aspect is that there should be even-handedness between religions. That I'm talking here about public policy, of course, public policy, law, and state matters. That if, for instance, in Britain, and in the Netherlands as well for that matter, but not in all countries, we have within the publicly funded educational sector, we have schools run by religious organizations, churches and so on. If that is the case in relation to one religion, then it should be the case in relation to other religions, if they ask for it, if they want it. And of course, there may be other criteria to do with the quality of the school. I'm not saying this is a kind of a laissez-faire thing. Just anyone says, oh, we're a religious group, give us a school, we just get on with it. I'm assuming that all the other issues about regulation and public standards and accountability and so on are in place, as they would be for other schools. I'm just talking about parity or even-handedness in treatment. Similarly, in Britain, we quite unusually have a second chamber in our parliament which is unelected. It may change, but for the last 750 years it's been unelected. And bishops have a right, various groups of people have a right to sit in that chamber. It used to be mainly aristocrats, but most of them were thrown out just a few years ago, less than 10 years ago. But bishops of the Church of England have a right to sit there. And other bishops, like the Archbishop of a Catholic Archbishop, is selected to sit there, and so on. Well, even-handedness would mean that we say, well, if we're going to carry on doing this, let's also include Muslims and Hindus and Jews and Sikhs and so on. So that's what I mean by even-handedness. I call it even-handedness because, of course, different religious groups will be of very different sizes, so it'd be very difficult to have a kind of a numerical basis for doing this. It could end up looking quite odd. And secondly, religions are not all of one kind. They organize themselves in different ways. And it may be that a particular religion, and actually I think Islam and Hinduism are like this, organize themselves in such a way, because they don't have a church hierarchy, Sunni Islam doesn't, that it may be quite difficult to simply replicate what one does with the Church of England and say, yes, okay, we'll do that with Muslims and Hindus. So that's why I say even-handedness, because it does leave some necessary room for context and appropriateness. One has to transfer sometimes, exercise some judgment about what would be equality here. Not just, oh well, they do it in the Church of England, so why don't they do it in Islam? Tell all the Muslims, choose your archbishop, choose your chief imam. We do it, you must do it, send him and we'll put him in the House of Lords for you. Well, that may be a kind of numerical parity, but it's not equality, because it's not respecting that religious community and its community structures and norms and forms of authority. So that's why even-handedness, rather than a kind of straight across the board form of equality. So that was the second dimension. The third dimension is what I've called, if I had a PowerPoint here, this is what you'd see, what I've called the positive inclusion of religious groups. So I'm just spelling out what I think religious equality means, applying multicultural equality as our baseline, as our frame. Now, what I mean by positive inclusion is best dealt with by giving you an example. The BBC, and it's just an example, other organisations do it as well, the BBC, for a number of years now, has had a certain policy position in relation to equality, which is that they feel that there are three groups in the population that they fail to serve in the way that they should in relation to equality. That there are three groups in the population that are underrepresented or underserved in relation to both its personnel, the staff, and in relation to programming. What are these three groups? They identified them some years ago, and each year they offer a statement of whether they're making any progress in addressing the underrepresentation. The three groups are women, ethnic minorities, and in Britain, Martin was referring to that terminology and changes in terminology, and terminology, of course, is different across countries and so on. By ethnic minorities, in 95% plus context, we mean people who are not white. So we could say, well, the Irish are an ethnic minority, the Jews are an ethnic minority, the Italians are an ethnic minority. And in some very, very rare cases, that's what we mean. But when it comes to any of these equality issues, that's not what we mean. So we already have a kind of, if you like, a racialized idea of ethnic minority. An ethnic minority just then works within that racialized kind of black-white or white, non-white split. So that's their second underrepresentation. Ethnic minorities, meaning non-white people. And thirdly, young people. Okay, fair enough. That's very good that they've identified this. And of course, what they mean is that that underrepresentation is in some sense a failure. It's a failure of inclusion. It's a failure of equality. And they need to do something about it, and they say they are. But why not religious groups as well? Why should their list be those three and those three alone? Perhaps they should have some other population groups. And on the concept of religious equality, why not, they say, we will have failed to be an egalitarian, inclusive, responsible organization, as a public sector broadcaster, if we don't have Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs in the BBC and influencing our program output. That's what I mean by positive inclusion. Well, what kind of implications does this have if we go with this kind of idea of multicultural equality and religious equality as a part of the family of multicultural equality, what implications does it have? I think there are 4 implications that I want to present to you, but some of them we can get through very quickly. Firstly, that multiculturalism is a collective project and includes collectivities. That's pretty obvious. We're talking about groups and collectivities, so I won't say anything more about that. Secondly, that multiculturalism is not difference blind. You know, colour, gender, sexual orientation blind. It's not. I've already dealt with that slightly, and in a way it's obvious as well. I think the next 2 issues are less obvious, and so I'll take a couple of minutes to explain those. I think one of the implications that what I've been saying has is that the kinds of identities that multiculturalism is interested in, you know, the kinds of difference that multiculturalism is interested in, goes beyond ascriptive identities. It goes beyond identities of fate or biology, you know, like the genes that make one dark skin or blonde haired or male or female. It goes beyond all that. It goes beyond even socially ascribed identities, because those identities can all be dealt with at the level of what we might call anti-discrimination. But when we look at what multiculturalism is in practice and in theory, well, for instance, one of the things that we understand as multiculturalism in Britain, and I'm sure everywhere else, is we should include black history in our European school curricula. Why should that be excluded? Because people in school are learning something about their history. That's why, you know, Dutch history is pretty central to the curriculum of schools here, and British history elsewhere. It would be very odd if everyone in the Netherlands was studying British history and we in Britain weren't studying British history, but we were studying Dutch history. Our history curriculum is shaped by a number of criteria, but one of which is we're studying our history. And by studying our history, of course, we are ourselves creating the identity of who the we are. So to leave out the history of people of African descent, when people of African descent are now part of British society and Dutch society and French society and so on, is not a very good way of being inclusive and multiculturalist. But this black in black history is not simply an ascribed identity, because we can all think about people who are of African descent and who say, well, this history is nothing to me, is of no importance to me. They're not denying the fact that their ancestors came from Africa, but all they're saying is, I'm not interested in this history. I don't want my children studying it. I much rather they actually learn something more about European history, because we're all part of contemporary Europe and part of a future Europe. That's what they might say, that's my identity, that I'm a European. A black European maybe, but I'm a black British European. So why do we have to learn something about black slavery and black people under colonialism and so on? They say, I don't want that. It's just like someone, you know, a woman saying, well, I'm not very interested in women's studies. You know, whether that person is wise or not, it doesn't matter. We can understand that situation. So the identity that multiculturalism is interested in, you know, black identity or women's identity and so on, is not simply the one to do with fate or social ascription. Another way of bringing out this point is we might say, what if one or more of the relevant groups that we were interested in terms of multiculturalism was a religious group, and yet suffered all kinds of socioeconomic disadvantage, like high levels of unemployment, discrimination in the labour market, living in deprived neighbourhoods, socially under-resourced neighbourhoods and so on. And we might say, well, yes, okay, and this group, let's say they're Muslims, because actually that fits the facts. We might say, well, it's irrelevant that they're Muslims. The issue is they haven't got jobs. The issue is that employers are discriminating against them because they have prejudice and stereotypes against them, etc., etc., or they're poorly qualified because the schools they go to are poorly resourced. The fact they're Muslims is irrelevant. We might say, well, what we need is not Muslim identity, what we need are better schools, anti-discrimination, more jobs, better paid jobs. Well, multiculturalism must be about respect for people, respect for those who've been excluded, marginalized, or who are in some sense were outsiders and now need to be included in egalitarian and respectful ways. And one of the ways we show respect for people is to say, if this identity is important to you, if this is what you say you are, then we will respect you on your own terms. So to say to somebody, if they say, we Muslims are suffering from high levels of social deprivation, to say, well actually, it's not the Muslims that are suffering, it's the working class people of this area that are suffering, is in some ways to deny people the identity that is important to them. So that's another way of making the point that I'm making, that the identities that we're interested in multiculturalism go beyond merely the socially ascribed. Turning to the fourth point, remember I said there were 4 implications? Now this implication is the one that squarely now, and you might say, well finally, gets me to secularism, though I hope you can see the implications of what I've been saying so far about religious groups for secularism. But here now, I finally come to the fourth, finally come to secularism. Because the fourth implication is that Muslim identity assertiveness, and as a matter of fact it is very much Muslim, though of course they're not the only group in the fray. Muslim identity assertiveness has created a challenge to liberal citizenship. It's created a challenge to the view that organized religion is a private community matter, not to do with state policy or state provision or citizenship. And that is, in one sentence, that is the baseline definition of political secularism, that organized religion is a private community matter not to do with state policy or state provision or citizenship. So here we have Muslim identity assertiveness broadly within a kind of multiculturalist political framing that's challenging the secularist idea. Well, I'll begin by noting a couple of things, which is that this view that religion is a private community matter, etc., etc., is not a view that most religious people have held historically or today, if we take the globe as a whole. So the very concept of religion that we have to deal with here is a concept of religion that may not be the self-understanding of a lot of people's religious understanding, or at least of some key minorities, like of course Muslims. So there's a stipulative definition of religion within the very understanding of secularism. Now that doesn't mean that it has to be rejected. When I say it's stipulative, I'm not saying, oh, that's bad, therefore it has to be rejected. Because of course, there may be a good argument. And people do believe they have good, normative, liberal, democratic arguments for why it should be like this. My point is that the definition of religion within secularism is not neutral between religions, because it fits some religions or some religious people, but not others. And that's an important point, because there is a self-understanding among secularists that they're somehow neutral about religion. In fact, there is an argument which says multiculturalism must lead to secularism, because multiculturalism must mean neutrality between all religions. Because how can we privilege the Church of England and Britain when the citizenship is composed of so many other religions as well? We have to be neutral between all of them. That's an argument for multiculturalism. I'm saying, well actually, neutrality is not at the core of secularism, though some people misleadingly think it is. And more than that, actually secularism is quite an interventionist approach. It's quite an interventionist policy because it tries to shape or limit or channel religion and religious people's behavior and self-understanding in certain kinds of ways. And these kinds of ways have historically been quite successful, especially in Western Europe, to a lesser extent in North America as well, and a few other places. But this is a political project. It's not just some kind of neutral view of the world, and the understanding of religion doesn't just kind of drop from the sky. It's a historically produced, politically produced understanding of religion. The second thing I'll note about this is that, and this is obviously very important to the story I'm telling, is that this idea of religion, namely religion is a private community matter not to do with politics, etc., is exactly the opposite of how I define multiculturalism. Because I define multiculturalism as an understanding of equality that sees inequality in the public-private divide. So it is the non-privatization, it's the opposite, what I would call, if you like, the publicizing of certain denigrated identities, of certain marginalized forms of difference. And in secularism says exactly the opposite about religion, and uniquely about religion. It doesn't take that view in relation to gender or race or ethnicity or sexual orientation, but uniquely about religion, that religion is best when it's privatized, but if you're a multiculturalist, race, ethnicity, gender, and so on are best when they're not forcibly privatized. So in global terms, secularism is using an understanding of religion, which is a minority view, which is fine, nothing wrong with that, but we must understand that in normative terms, it's not neutral, and it is actively shaping people to fit into a certain understanding of religion. Now, I'm not taking the view that everybody's religious identity has to be publicized, made public, whether they like it or not. That would of course be a complete violation of people's individual rights and a complete violation of religious freedom, and nothing in what I'm saying implies that. If you like, to understand what I'm saying, let's use a parallel from something that gay people have argued, which is, of course, we must allow sexual orientation, including homosexual and lesbian identities, we must allow privacy for those identities, but we mustn't forcibly privatize them. We mustn't ghettoize them. So gay people can be gay in public. They can wear a badge or dress in a way or have clubs and bars and parades, and even a member of parliament or whatever can say, I'm gay, so what? Or I'm gay, I'm proud, or I'm gay and this is why I follow this policy, or whatever. So that's in a way what I want to argue about for religious identity. Why should it be privatized? If gay identity doesn't have to be privatized, if racial identities don't have to be privatized, why should religious identity be privatized unless the people themselves want them privatized? And some will, and that's fine. Perhaps a lot of us in this room would say, yeah, that's how I want my religion. I don't want everybody thinking about me in kind of publicly religious terms. That's fine. Perhaps that's how I think myself. But what about the people who don't? Are we going to say to them, actually, you're a minority, you don't have any rights in this matter, you're about to be outvoted because we want it this way? Or are we going to say, okay, those who want their religious identities to be about something to do with spirituality, belief, what we think about kind of the inner self, fine, and they can all do that in church on Sundays, or they can go to seances and whatever they want to do, and worship Mother Earth and Gaia and so on. But those who actually think that their religion has something to say about society, has something to say about how we should live and so on, why should they have to shut up just because these other people say, oh, I've got nothing to say about any of that? Surely they should be able to make up their own minds and follow their own religious injunctions and norms and so on. And they may change over time, so I'm not assuming that it's like a divide that will always hold. there could be traffic from one side to the other over time. In fact, that actually has happened. If we think about Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, we see that in many ways, the things that Roman Catholics, especially their hierarchy and intellectuals and so on, argued against 200 years ago, because they said they were all Protestant and liberal and rationalist and enlightenment, they're all in favour of now. They're all in favour of individual rights and human rights and democracy. I mean, the church had encyclicals, papal encyclicals against democracy. No Catholic gets up now and says, democracy, that's a terrible anti-Christian thing. So there can be change over time, but why should we, in the name of secularism, force people to say, sorry, don't talk about religion here. This is a political space, this is the public space. But this is exactly what some Western European intellectuals are doing. You know, in the name of back to the Enlightenment or something like that. Though it's worth noting that the Enlightenment that they have in mind is the French Enlightenment, and not the Scottish Enlightenment like David Hume or someone like that. That didn't lead to all that anti-clericalism and bloodshed and so on. And I think that this fourth challenge, as I've presented to you, is philosophically speaking not different in kind to the non-colourblind, non-different blind points that I've already been making. It just seems different because we are all so, you know, committed to a certain political view about multiculturalism. I say we all, I mean, you know, most of us, most of the time. But I think that if we think about it, if we reflect on it, Muslim identity in countries like ours, in societies like ours, is actually a very similar kind of mix between chosen and unchosen, as, you know, black identity is. When I was talking to you about nobody chooses their genes, but people choose whether they think, you know, I'm black and proud and we should have Black History Month, or whether they say, black, well, what's the big deal? Let's get on with something more interesting like human rights or watching the telly or whatever. What's the big thing about black culture? Well, being a Muslim is exactly the same, or comparable anyway, because obviously being a Muslim can be about beliefs and practice that one acquires and then carries on as an adult, or one gives them up and says, oh, not interested anymore. So that's the personal element. But there are aspects of being a Muslim that are clearly not chosen, because one doesn't choose to be born into a Muslim family or not. One doesn't choose the society around one, which could be full of stereotypes and phobias and so on about Muslims, and racializing Muslims by profiling them or by attributing all kinds of say, prejudices and stereotypes and political contestations around Muslims and so on. So I think being a Muslim in the Netherlands today, in Britain today and so on, is a bit like an ethnic identity. We're talking about an ethno-religious identity, because there are aspects in which it can be, you know, thickened and thinned, and there are other aspects about which individuals have relatively little control, because it's much more socially structured and formed. But of course, what individuals can do is, as a group, okay, thanks, they can to some extent make that identity more important or less important. So you might say, well, look, 15 years ago, very few people were going around saying, I'm a Muslim, and I want politicians or the media or the rest of society to attend to that fact. Well, that's true, but that's, you know, that's true about race, it's true about ethnicity, it's true about gender. That's not peculiar to do with Muslims. Certain identities become salient because of a political context. That is entirely true. And they rise and they fall, and exactly the same might happen to Muslim. It's obviously risen at the moment for all kinds of reasons that we're all aware of, some which come from Muslims, and some which come from the outside onto Muslims, and some in the interaction between the two. But I don't see how religious identities like being a Muslim in the Netherlands is really very different from the kinds of identities that multiculturalism theorizes about and politically promotes in some way. But I don't think this clash that I've been describing to you, therefore, between multiculturalism and secularism is a genuine, deep clash. I don't think we need to choose between multiculturalism and secularism. Because for a start, secularism has different meanings in practice. And secondly, the practice is actually hospitable. In most countries that we're interested in, like our own, most democratic countries, the practice is hospitable for claims of organized religion, though differently in different countries. And this is actually where a PowerPoint slide would have been helpful, because I could have shown you very quickly a couple of countries, because I don't have a lot of time left. But I'll just make one contrast and then just conclude really, and then we could have more discussion in due course after the break. I mean, look at the contrast between Britain and the United States. Everybody knows that in Britain we have an established church. It's not very politically powerful, but we have an established church. One of the things that means is that our head of state, the monarch, is not a head of state till the Archbishop of Canterbury puts the crown on his or her head. So, that is obviously a great symbolic power. Only the Archbishop of Canterbury can do it. On the other hand, Britain is not a very religious society, either in terms of its public sphere or in terms of people's private lives. A lot of people will say that they're religious or Christian, roughly about 70%, but less than 10% go to church regularly. And when you ask them about what does it mean to be a Christian and so on, you get very, very thin answers. It's much more a kind of a background sense of, well, God exists and I guess he's Christian because that's the only God I know about, or, well, of course, when I get married, it'll be in a church, or when my baby's christened, it'll be in a church. It doesn't go a lot thicker than that. Okay, so that's Britain. Look at the contrast with the United States, which, as everybody knows, has a constitutional amendment saying there shall be no establishment and there shall be a wall of separation between the state and the church. So they're exactly the opposite of Britain. So you could say they're the true secular society. Britain's kind of, usual muddling through, mixed up, confused. But America, they know what secularism is. Look at their constitution. But look at their president. And not just this one, though this one makes the point for me more dramatically than others, but prayer meetings in the White House and in the houses of Congress and Senate are perfectly normal. Nobody thinks there's anything odd. You invite loads of preachers and pastors in and get into a hug with them, and breakfast prayer meetings are perfectly normal way of starting the working day in Capitol Hill. Whereas in Britain, we'd be flabbergasted. And if I could just summarize that, or not summarize it, but illustrate it through just one dramatic episode. President Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair met for some kind of war summit meeting, Iraq war summit meeting, a few years ago. And it was rumored, or it was more than rumored, it was told to the American press, I believe, that the two had prayed together. And it was hardly covered in the news in America because nobody was interested. Well, George Bush would be praying and he was praying with Tony Blair, what's the big deal? Whereas in Britain, it created a great sensation. When Tony Blair's plane arrived back at Heathrow, enormous number of press wanted a press conference. They said, we must know, is it true that Tony Blair prayed with the President of the United States? And the spokesman for the Prime Minister, very famous Alistair Campbell, came forward and he said, calm it, calm it. He said, we don't do God, when they asked him all these questions, meaning I refuse to answer any of these questions because Tony Blair's religious beliefs, even though he's the First Minister of the Crown, his beliefs are his own. They're nothing to do with him as Prime Minister and the state and so on. So, which is the secular country? America, where 40% of the population say they'll only vote for someone with an evangelical Christian agenda, or in Britain, where nobody knows anyone's political, religious beliefs, but we have an archbishop putting a crown on the head of our monarch. Well, that more or less leads me to the point where I must conclude and stop. I have a long conclusion, but it's too long, so I think the short conclusion goes something like this. Secularism as privatized religion by law is not compatible with multiculturalism. Yet, the good news is that that secularism doesn't exist. It certainly isn't what exists in the Netherlands, in the United States, in Britain, or even, bless them, France. They think it does. In fact, loads of British intellectuals think they do. They keep saying, why can't we be like France? But even in France, a minister of state holds meetings with organized religious people who are brought in because they represent an organized faith. You can't just walk off the street and say, well, I've got something to say as well. The difference in France is that it's controlled by the state, and that's not a very good model for multiculturalism. So what exists in the world is a form of secularism, certainly, but it's a form of secularism that is moderate, it's varied across countries, and it's institutionally adaptive. We see institutions changing all the time. They're not hidebound and fixed. And if you like, so the boundary of religion and the state shifts over time, over generations, and as new actors, new agents come into the picture. So in Britain, we had a very different understanding in England when the Church of England was the only dominant institution. But now the Catholic Church is very important. We divide things up differently. And so I want to argue that what exists, practical, real-world secularism, which I'll call institutional secularism as opposed to ideological secularism, that what exists can be and should be adapted. And actually, through the examples of inclusion that I was giving in relation to the BBC, for instance, but the House of Lords, school funding and so on, can be a vehicle for multicultural equality.